Hello and welcome to the third chapter of the course. In this chapter, we start looking at common scenarios that occur in game. And more specifically, the scenario we'll focus on is how do we open, like RFI or jam, as the covering stack, as the bigger stack in a non-ICM environment. We'll have a lot of different chapters covering different scenarios, so this is the one we'll be looking at now. We will not be paying too much attention at the responses from the players behind. This is reserved for a future chapter. We'll instead be focusing on the opening from the bigger stack. So we have this spot over here. It is a 530 PKO where everyone has the starting stack. The big blind is 500. We can actually see this in chips as well. Right, so the big blind is 500 and the starting stack is 25k. As I said, this is very early on in the tournament. Everyone has a starting bounty. So by following the bounty value that we saw in the theory chapter, we know that it is worth about a fourth of the starting stack, which would be about 6.5k. So a bounty is worth around 13 big blinds. The first spot we want to look at is how wide can the cutoff open? We'll look at under the gun as well a little bit later, but first let's start with the cutoff. So the cutoff is the covering stack and covers the bottom, the small, and the big blind by quite a bit. So he is supposed to be opening fairly wide. But how wide exactly? What does that mean? Well, the best way to approach this is to solve the spot on HRC, which is what I did. First, let's look at what he would be opening in a normal non-PKO tournament. If this was a vanilla, this is what the cutoff range is supposed to look like. So he's supposed to be opening about 37.8%. With the PKO added and him covering everyone, especially with the button being so short, the cutoff is definitely looking to expand his opening range. By how much though? Well, he's supposed to open 47.3%. He goes from 37 up to 47, so it's an extra 10% of hands added. We start opening a range that looks much closer to that of a button range, with the offsuit 8x and queen 2 suited, jack 3 suited, 7-4, 4-3, and so on. The reasoning behind that is that the players behind can't really play back as much when they're covered. They can't really bluff that much. So our equity realization from the cutoff ends up going much higher. Just as a quick look, so when we play the normal GPV scenario, the button is supposed to call 12% and jam another 12%. So he's folding 73.8% of the time. Whereas in the PKO scenario, when we open, you can see the button is folding 78%. So it goes from folding 73 to folding 78, so he has to fold a lot more. And also the calling frequency just goes down a lot. He ends up jamming. So this extra 8% falls from the button just allows the cutoff to be opening much wider. Same goes for the other positions too. The blinds will be 3-betting less. So overall, equity realization goes way up. So the cutoff just gets to open a lot more. The more significant the bounties are and the shorter the stack size is behind, the wider the cutoff gets to open. So now let's keep the same scenario where we're talking about the cutoff, but let's change the stack sizes a bit. Instead of being one middle stack and two short stacks, let's look at what would happen if it was two short stacks and one middle stack on the bottom, one similar stack as the cutoff. Let's open the scene and look at this one. So first, we want to look at the vanilla non-PKO scene where the cutoff is supposed to be opening 32%. So with one similar stack and one short stack, the cutoff's opening range goes from 32% all the way up to 50.5%. Because now there are two very short stacks where the cutoff just gets to raise call with almost his entire range, given that they are jamming 20 big blinds and the cutoff has just enough equity to call off when there are 13 blinds added to the pot because of the bounty. So we end up opening 50%. And against a jam from, let's say, the small blind, we get to call off, as I said, almost our entire range. We just have so much added dead money to the pot because of the bounty that we don't really get to fold. The risk premium reduction for the cutoff against the blind is 11.9%, so almost 12% of an equity reduction for us to call the all-in. Very, very significant difference, opening from 32% in a normal tournament to opening over 50% now in the PKO example. But what if instead of this, everyone had 20 big blinds behind? So cutoff still has 57, but everyone behind has 20 big blinds. In the vanilla example, so non-PKO, the cutoff would be opening about 32%, so similar as before. And he wouldn't really have almost any jams. Well, no jams. However, in the PKO example, where everyone has 20 big blinds and their bounties are worth 13, things will change a lot. So what happens here is that the cutoff gets to fold 46% still, which is quite a bit, but he gets to jam about 17% of the time. So our VPAP increases again by a decent margin. We fold 46%, where before we're folding 68. So we get to VPAP about 20 to 23% more hands. And we also start having a bunch of jams with offsuit ace-x, like middling pocket pairs, some suited kings. The reason that we jam, say, pocket sixes but not pocket fours or threes isn't that jamming these hands is unprofitable. It still is. It's just raise calling is slightly more profitable for some blockier reasons. It doesn't really matter too much. A lot of these hands will be very close in EV between raising or jamming. But for example, the offsuit ace-x are the ones that benefit from jamming a lot. As for what we raise call, again, if we raise and say the small blind jams, then we get to call just almost our entire opening range again, just not really folding anything, besides the absolute worst hands we have. Okay, so again, we can see a very, very big difference. Now, let's have a look at a few more scenarios for this spot. First, what if instead of the short stacks, of the stacks behind just being short, what if there were actually micro stacks, like 10 big blinds? What would happen then? So again, we assume the cutoff has the stack size and the guys behind have 10 big blinds instead of having 20 as we saw before. Again, in the vanilla example, the cutoff gets to play jams only and gets to jam about 31% of the time. So Broadway's, some of the better suited stuff, pocket pairs, ace-x, sure. In the PKO example, where, again, the guys behind have 10 big blinds and their bounty is worth 13, then we get to play really, really aggressively. We get to VPAP almost our entire range. You can see we're only folding 3%. We just jam a super, super wide range of hands. Now, why HRC wants to be raise calling, or maybe even raise folding these offsuit 10x, but not like 7-3 off, I am not sure. It just has to do with the blocker effects a little bit. And just about this specific scenario, it's not something we should try to figure out too much. Instead, what we need to take into account is that we are jamming almost any two cards. And I don't even think we have any raise folds. Let's see. So if we raise and our friend's small blind jams, we just don't really have any raise folds. It just chooses to raise call these hands for some blocker effect thing. It doesn't matter. We should just play jams here. So super, super wide jamming range, we're only folding the absolute worst garbage we can ever have. It is always important while playing to think about the bounty and turn it into chips so that we can figure out how much our opponent's stack matters or not. So in this spot where their stack is 10 big blinds and their bounty is 13, well, their stack really just doesn't matter. Then one more example that I would like to look at is what if we have, again, same big stack on the cutoff. We have one middling stack behind, with 25 big blinds. And the two blinds just have a very, very micro stack. So they are at 10 big blinds each. What happens then? How wide do we get to open? How wide do we get to jam? Well, again, we want to look at what happens in a normal vanilla tournament first. So the cutoff gets to fold 70%, so VPIP 30%. We jam some pocket pairs, suited aces, some offsuit stuff like this, suited broadways. But we mostly want to be raising the majority of our range. Again, the stacks are 25 for the button, 10 for the small blind, and 13 for the big blind. Everyone's still having the starting bounty. So this is in the vanilla scenario, but when we add the bounties, then we have some pretty interesting mechanics in play. What happens is that the cutoff gets to VPIP over 77% of his range, but there is no jamming. Even though we had jams before in the normal non-PKO tournament, we don't get jams in the PKO. Is it that jams aren't profitable? No, of course they are. If we look at EV, we can profitably jam a super big portion of our range. Instead, raising becomes much better because of the stack disparity between the button and the blinds. So when we open and we face a jam from the small blind, we can still call pretty much our entire range. So that doesn't really change. But instead, we get to save some money when the button jumps, because obviously we cannot call our entire range against the button. We have to fold some of our complete garbage. And also we get to play post-flop with a lot of our strong hands. I think this is a very interesting mechanic and something we should keep in mind. That in spots like this with mixed stack sizes, we actually want to be raising a lot and not jamming. We can still raise call the short stacks, but nothing changes there. But we get to play post-flop against the bigger stack with some of our stronger hands. And we can also fold some of the weak garbage we have when he ends up waking up with the hand and jamming on us. One final thing I want to show you about this cutoff situation is, let's go back to a scenario where the guys behind all have 20 big blinds, but instead of the cutoff having 57, let's assume that the cutoff still covers, but instead of 57, the cutoff has 25 big blinds. So covering, yes, but by a little bit. Do things change then? Well, what we want to do is compare the situation where the cutoff has, as I said, 25 big blinds to the situation we saw before where the cutoff just had 57. So we want to compare it against this one. And in the situation where the cutoff had 57 and the guys behind had 20, the cutoff, as we said, was folding 46.3%, jamming about 17, and raising 36.8. Now, when the cutoff has 25, we can notice a small adjustment to the cutoff's range. Basically, the cutoff folds slightly more and jams a bit of a stronger range. Back to the 57 big blind stack for the cutoff, we can see jams with like King 6 off and Queen 3 suited, Queen 4 suited. Whereas now, these jams are a lower frequency and these like Queen 3, Queen 4 hands instead go into the raising node. Why did this happen? Well, the raise premiums will be the same. If we have a look here, when the cutoff has 25 big blinds, his risk premium against the other positions is minus 11.4, 11.8, 11.8. And when the cutoff has 57, you can see it's basically the same. So it's not that, but instead what this is about is the value of our stack dropping when we end up losing the spot with 25 big blinds, because after the hand, we just don't really cover anyone. This is the thing that I mentioned that isn't reflected too much in the solver. And in spots like this, it also doesn't matter too much because we just won't get called that often. But it's definitely something that we should have to the back of our head. When we have a very marginal spot, we need to think about how will this affect our stack if things go bad or if things go good. And in this example, now that the cutoff has 57 big blinds, and the other guys have 20, if the cutoff ends up losing the all-in, the cutoff still covers a decent amount of the table. Whereas if the cutoff goes from 25 down to 5 big blinds, then of course the cutoff doesn't cover anyone anymore, and the EV of the stack drops down significantly because of that. Small difference here, and something that the solver doesn't fully take into account because the future game simulation is very limited. But it's something we should keep in mind. And with that, we can move on from the cutoff situation and look at under the gun. So in this scenario, how wide is under the gun supposed to be opening in the PKO where we just cover everyone? And we will follow the same thought process as before, where we want to compare it to a normal GPV spot. So if this was a normal vanilla tournament, the under the gun player would be opening about 17.7%. As we know, under the gun has to be pretty tight, right? So without the bounties, opening 17.7. Now, with the bounties, adding an extra 13 blinds for each player whenever we face aggression, what happens is that our opening range gets dramatically increased. We go from opening 17 to opening 25%. So we add a lot of suited connected hands to our range. We don't really add many blocker hands. Like you can see, we don't start opening 8-9 off because it just doesn't really flop well. We don't start opening like that many offsuit broadways. Yeah, we expand a bit, but like Queen 10 off, Jack 10 off, King 10 off still folds or break even opens. Instead, we add a lot of suited connected hands. Why? Because these hands flop way better and we can actually stack people off with them. One thing that happens is that in the PKO scenario, when people are covered, they don't really 3-bet much. They instead go for a more call-heavy approach. So we can see people behind, for example, the guy next to us who has 26.5 big blinds isn't really doing much 3-betting. He's instead playing a much more call-heavy strategy, calling 9.2%. In the normal example, in like a vanilla tournament, we can see now there is less calling and way more 3-betting. So the same is true for the other positions too. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on how the other positions are supposed to react against the open. We will examine that in a future chapter. But in general, there is a lot less 3-betting and a lot more calling. So we want to go for more suited connected hands that actually flop well. And yeah, you can see a very big dramatic increase. One final thing I want to look at is, again, let's stick to this under the gun situation, but let's change the stack size a bit. Let's assume that instead of there being so many middling stacks, every stack is 20 big blinds besides 2. We have MP, who has the same stack as we do, and we have the big blind, who has about 55 big blinds. So we have one similar stack and one big stack, but not as big as ours. How does this affect our range? And what ends up happening is that we overall want to be opening much wider in that situation, because we can raise call against the source stacks quite comfortably, while the bigger stacks don't really want to 3-bet against us. They instead want to play a much more call-heavy strategy. And we can check that out on the solver. We have this one. So we go from opening 24.7 with the normal stack sizes to opening 32.8. And the way this works is that, let's say MP, who has the same stack as we do, you can see he isn't really supposed to 3-bet almost anything. Instead, wants to continue by calling their entire range because they want to induce jumps behind and they want to get to play post-flop against some other positions. And basically, the same applies for the other bigger stacks. So we get to open really wide in situations like this because the big stacks we don't really mind. They're not supposed to 3-bet, they just call. Whereas the shorter stacks, we can just raise call them pretty wide when they end up jamming. For example, if we face a jam from the button in this spot who has 21 big blinds, then we get to call, as you can see, really, really wide pocket pairs, a lot of strong suited stuff, ace 10 off, and so on. I think we looked at a bunch of different situations when we are the covering stack in GPV situation. And again, for PKOs, there isn't like a really ground rule that I can provide or say a static range because many factors affect our decision. Our stack size, the players behind stack size, everything. However, we can make some pretty good general conclusions and assumptions from the scenes we've seen. Basically, we want to be opening really, really wide when we are the covering stack. Of course, again, it depends on the bounty and how large they are, how much of an effect they have. For example, if we were deeper in the tournament and the starting bounty was worth like 2 or 3 big blinds instead of 13, this would affect our opening range a lot. We would play closer to GPV. The more effect the bounty has, the wider we get to open. We also saw that in mixed stack sizes, we don't really want to be doing much jamming. We instead want to be raising very wide and raise calling a lot against the shorter stacks. It's very important for us to visualize the effect of the bounty when we are the covering stack and how this should affect our ranges. Hopefully you got a lot of information from the scenes we've seen, and we will look at ICM simulations for this scenario in a bit of a later chapter. So we can wrap this up and then move to the next chapter, which is about raising and jamming when we are the covered stack instead of the covering stack.